One day, Jesus was teaching, and a lawyer came up to him with a question. Now, lawyers worked hard for their position. They knew the law backwards and forwards, and because of that, they had money and power and clout in the community. But this lawyer wanted to make sure that all his effort, all that he's dedicated his life to, had been worth it. So he asked Jesus, "How do I inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, actually, you're the expert in the law. How do you do it?" And the lawyer replies that the law says you have to do two things. Love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, yes, that's exactly right. But then we get to the real heart of the lawyer's question. He says, okay, but who is my neighbor? And he's looking here for a boundary, for a definition. He knows he's supposed to love his neighbor as himself, but he wants to know how many people fit into that neighbor category that he has to love. Does that literally mean his next door neighbor? Or maybe it's everyone in his neighborhood or in his town. Or maybe it goes so far as to be an obligation to all his fellow countrymen. Where does he draw the line? So Jesus does a very Jesus thing here. He doesn't answer the question directly, he tells a story. The story is about a man who was going on a journey from Jerusalem, the big city, to Jericho, a village a little ways away. And while he's walking down this road, some people robbed him and beat him up and left him in a ditch. Now along comes a priest. Priests were leaders in the temple of Jerusalem, and you have to remember that for ancient Israel, especially at this time when they are under the control of the Roman Empire and not a free country, religious leaders were really the main authorities. They didn't have much of their own separate political leadership while the Romans were in charge. And so, of those religious leaders, the priests were at the top of the hierarchy. So you could think of this today as almost like saying a senator walked by. Or if you wanted to stick to the religious analogy, a really important pastor, maybe a bishop in a denomination that has those. And the priest clearly sees him lying there helplessly because he intentionally crosses the street and walks by as far away as he can. Then comes a Levite. Levites were also religious leaders, but not as high up as the priests. So this might be like a pastor from a local church or maybe a town council member walking by. And he also sees the poor guy, crosses the street, and leaves him stranded. And then comes a Samaritan. Now, Samaritans were like the enemy. Like, not just someone who was different or mildly disliked. They were someone you weren't supposed to speak with because it would taint your reputation to be seen with a Samaritan. If this was Romeo and Juliet, our guy in the ditch would be a Montague, and this guy coming down the road was a Capulet. In the animal world, this was like an injured bunny seeing a fox sneaking up on it, or a cat seeing a dog coming down the street. It's bad news bears. This poor guy in the ditch is just hoping the Samaritan doesn't see him, because if he does, he might beat him up even more or take the last things the robbers didn't steal. But the Samaritan does see him, and he starts walking over to him. And the guy is probably super nervous, like in the movies when somebody says, "It could be worse," and then instantly it starts raining. That's what this guy thinks is about to happen. But that's not what happens. The Samaritan actually comes over, treats his wounds, gets him up on his horse, and takes him to the nearest hotel where he books him a room for the next week so he can recover and pays for all his meals. If you are one of the people listening to Jesus tell this story for the first time, this is like a jaw-dropping moment. And while everyone's mouths are still hanging open, Jesus turns to the lawyer who asked, "Who is my neighbor?" and says, "So which one was the better neighbor?" And the lawyer can't even bring himself to say Samaritan. That's how much he dislikes these people. So he just says, "The guy who takes care of him was the better neighbor." And Jesus says, "Go and do the same. That's how you inherit eternal life." We are wrapping up our Sunday school year with this story because it pulls together a lot of what we've talked about when we think about being a disciple in today's world. The lawyer nicely points out to us that being a disciple means loving God and loving our neighbors. And Jesus then tells us here a few things about what it means to love our neighbors. First, and most obviously, Jesus says that anyone can be our neighbor. The Samaritan, the enemy, was the neighbor in this case, as shocking as that was for the disciples to hear. And just as we started out the year learning that anyone can be called to be a disciple, even people we might not like that much, We're ending this year learning that as disciples, we are called to love everyone, even people we might not like that much. Second, what the Samaritan did when he loved his neighbor required him to make some sacrifices, right? He stopped his journey to care for this stranger on the road. He shelled out a bunch of money to pay for this man to stay at the hotel and be taken care of. This wasn't just being friendly and waving hello. He gave a significant amount of his time and money to help take care of this person, this stranger. So just as we learned when we heard about the rich young ruler who wants to follow Jesus, so too this Samaritan shows us that following Jesus and loving others requires us to give something up. And third, the Samaritan shows us what empathy looks like. He was a fellow traveler on that road. He also could have been the victim of robbers. So he felt for this man. He understood his suffering. He had compassion on him, just like Jesus did when he saw the hungry crowds in our story a few weeks ago. Loving our neighbor requires us to understand and empathize with the experience of others and with their needs. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can love our neighbors today, but for now, I want you to think about this story and imagine that you are the guy in the ditch. Can you imagine someone who, if you were stranded and saw them coming, you would think, no, not them, anybody but them? How would it feel to have that person be the one who helps you when you are in trouble? Now reverse the situation. How hard would it be for you to stop and help them if they were in trouble? How would it feel to help them? Keep those thoughts and feelings in mind this week, and we'll build on them in next week's lesson.